Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello, and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and in this episode, I'm going to talk about polyamorous relationships. Well, as it turns out, the concept of polyamorous relationships has to do with loving more than one. When you look up the words polyamorous, then basically it means loving more than one. And I'm talking about this because it's a spin on relationships that it's not about affairs, because affairs have secrecy and things surrounding them. Polyamorous, you need to know about yourself, and when you're sharing this information with your partner, just to give them an idea of who you are, and you're sharing your needs, you will most likely be looking for more than one partner. That's the nature of something like this. And in some cultures, men can take on more than one wife. And when that's the case, that's understood, it's accepted in that culture. But in Western culture, that's not typically what happens. What we more often will see is that when somebody has additional partners, there isn't always a lot of knowledge surrounding that. And, there's a bit of secrecy, or, I'm not going to get into some of the other aspects of that. I kind of want to keep this tight to the subject of polyamory, and that there is an open discussion about what the needs are. But going to, from the example I was speaking of certain cultures, a man may have more than one wife. See, one of the unique ideas of polyamory is that when a woman also has choices, so she could have more than one partner. And it becomes an interesting dynamic, whereas the open discussion of your needs, because there definitely has to be conversation about it in order for it to work. And, you do your research, you ask questions, you deal with the idea of jealousy. You deal with those kinds of things up front. And that's why I say you really need to know yourself. So if you have not heard of the term polyamorous relationships, here, I'm going to read something to you. And I've looked this up on Wikipedia just for expediency. Polyamory, many, several, and the Latin word amor, which means love, is the practice of or desire for intimate relationships where individuals may have more than one partner with the knowledge and consent of all the partners. It has been described as consensual, ethical, and responsible non-monogamy. The term polyamorous can refer to the nature of a person's relationships at some point in time, or to a philosophy. And although sometimes it's misperceived as a relationship orientation, like a sexual orientation, it isn't. And the orientation that draws people towards the practice of polyamory is non-monogamy. Now, non-monogamy has many forms of practice, and perhaps the most common being cheating. Other commonly recognized non-monogamous practices include swinging, open relationships, and polygamy. Now, polyamory is sometimes used in a broader sense, and it's an umbrella term that covers various forms of multiple relationships or forms of sexual or romantic relationships that are not sexually exclusive. Okay, so I read that it's sort of a snapshot into what the meaning of the relationships are. What it forces you to do, it forces you to sort of think about this in another way. There are cultures in which men have more than one wife, and in those cultures, that's totally accepted. You see, in Western culture, that's not generally how it's done. What Western culture generally understands is monogamy, and then goes from there. So if one of the partners tends to take on another relationship, it then ceases to be exclusive for at least that one person. And oftentimes this is done in secrecy. See, the thing about polyamory is the secrecy is not there. It's done with the understanding of both partners that you're seeking other companionship. So that obviously forces very important conversations about sexual health, about the emotional fidelity, all the kinds of things that make a monogamous relationship what it is, and that it's exclusive. Polyamory changes that. And as I can see, I gave you a few examples of things that are non-monogamous. It's become, I'm not going to say it's mainstream, but it's probably been practiced for many, many years. And as I've read a little more on that, it did express that. But it's becoming more talked about, so it's coming more to the surface. And because this is the relationship program, I'm going to discuss it with the idea of having an open conversation about it. And you may know somebody who's been in it. You may have read something in the press about it, and many of the listeners may have actually practiced it. And some people go to polyamory and then decide it doesn't work for them and then go back to monogamy. I can't say that there are pros and cons. I'm here to raise the conversation. But what I have come to understand more so as women themselves become more independent and have more choices and have more power in their lives to not only make the choices about where they want to go to school, where they want to live, who they want to have relationships with, and whether those relationships are exclusive. Because it has, in general, been understood that women didn't have the power to decide those things, because women have only had the right to vote since the 20th century. And since then, women have struggled to gain parity in the workplace, become bosses and equal pay, and be respected for the things that they hold dear. And it has been assumed that men were the power brokers and got to decide things. Now, when it comes to relationships, obviously there's two partners, at least in a monogamous relationship, the man and woman. And for that, the balance of power has oftentimes been one of those emotional struggles, because you do have that tug of war. Who's in control? You get a lot of passive aggressive kinds of things. Well, the polyamory thing, in terms of this, it tends to blow the doors on that, because the discussions have to be had, and it encourages it. If you do any research on this, it really is incumbent upon you to know something about yourself and to be able to ask the questions. And certain people are not going to be comfortable with you or your partner having someone else, another person as a confidant, or having other relationships. It just is very unsettling for a lot of people. And by that, I'm going to share a little bit more information with you on the topic. People who identify as polyamorous typically reject the view that sexual and relationship exclusivity are necessary for deep, committed, long-term loving relationships. Now, those who are open to or emotionally suited for polyamory may embark on a polyamorous relationship when single or already in a monogamous or open relationship. Sex is not necessarily a primary focus in polyamorous relationships, which commonly consist of people seeking to build long-term relationships with more than one person on mutually agreeable grounds, with sex as only one aspect of the relationships. Now, in practice, polyamorous relationships are highly varied and individualized according to those who are participating. Hence, that part about knowing yourself and why you would want another partner. So, to share it, typically when you're embarking on a relationship of monogamy, the idea is you are looking for a long-term partnership with that one individual. So if you're talking about marriage per se, then the loving part of it, all the emotional needs, and it's the courtship, the engagement. It gives you an opportunity to work out all of these types of things to find out if you're compatible, and then you seal the union by having a wedding ceremony, get the licenses, and so on and so forth. Now, with a polyamorous relationship, it would seem that it's easier from the standpoint of you have partnerships with various individuals for certain needs. I mean, if you have one person that you were seen to be very excited about and able to commit to for certain needs, somebody may be financially more responsible, that might be a good person to be in a relationship. But then if you have another person who seems to fit other needs, they're more of an exercise person, they want to go out to the gym, and that fits your need for that, then it would seem that there is a compatibility issue there. So you don't necessarily have to find one person that fits all, which can be very difficult. So I'm going to expand on this a little bit more, but I'm going to take a break, and then I'll come right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And we're back. This is Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, and I'm your host, John Johnson. And the topic of this program happens to be around the idea of polyamorous relationships. And if you're just kind of tuning into the podcast, it is a discussion of relationships that have more than one partner for each individual. Or at least one individual has more than one partner, and it's understood. It's a little. It's kind of like an open relationship, but it's with the understanding that you have other partners that you do things with, and it may or may not be sexual. That's not necessarily the drive, but it's just the understanding that you may love more than one person, and it is not an affair because the idea is to share that information with your partner. And as I had begun by sharing in the first segment, that there are cultures in which men happen to have more than one wife. Now, in polyamorous relationships, women happen to have the opportunity or the idea that they can have as many partners as they want as well. So, going into this a little deeper, I was talking of an example of a person having a partner for various needs. And instead of having one partner, say, for example, if you get married, you're committed to the one partner for all your needs. Whether you're going to the gym and you're going to the drive-in and so on and so forth. Having kids, the polyamorous relationship is one that allows the participants to have more than one partner. Now, I don't know anyone that is in a polyamorous relationship, and when thinking about this as a topic, I would have loved to have had an opportunity to do some of that as a research, and I can follow up with that. But I think about the long-term aspect of this, and there are pros and cons. I kind of laid out some of the attraction to it for individuals. But when I think of some of the negatives, I think about the long-term relationship here. Obviously, people come in and out of their feelings of experience, so I guess that can happen as well in a polyamorous relationship. Someone pops in and another person pops out, and who knows? It may happen with some sort of regularity, and they get used to that. I don't happen to know anyone that's been in a long-term polyamorous relationship, but when I think about some of the long-term aspects of it, let's say, for example, you have a partner that, I say maybe they get sick and die. I mean, who comes into being with the possessions? I guess if you have a will, then that discusses, that takes care of it. but who's emotionally going to be responsible for all of those things when you're in a polyamorous relationship? Is it going to be the person who seems to be in the relationship with them, or because none of these descriptions that I've read is there any talk of marriage. And in Western culture and cultures in general, where there's marriage, then that gives a person exclusive rights and responsibilities and entitlements. So in a polyamorous relationship, it doesn't seem like that's something that is there. I also wonder about the aspect of children in a polyamorous relationship. Now, if kids have already been born into a primary relationship and then one seeks to have a relationship outside of that, again, this is the understanding of the adults, but children may not necessarily have that comprehension or experience of it. But I guess if they're growing up in that experience, then it may seem more like a community as raising the children. And, there's that, which may be a good thing. But when it comes to some of the more private, more personal aspects of the relationship, say the adult time, let's say when there's, sexual encounter, I mean, if they see people disappearing into bedrooms and things like that. Now, I'm not trying to make this seamy. I'm just wondering the impact on children's minds about such a thing. But I guess that's something to think about and discuss, and that would be people who are in polyamorous relationships. Back to the individuals themselves that get involved. It is, and I've said this a couple of times, it's really important to understand yourself, because jealousy is often a reason that people break up. And when a relationship reaches a point where the people aren't communicating, when it would seem like if you have a polyamorous relationship, you've always got an out, you have an outlet. And in order to not always use that as an excuse to gang up against one person or another, that requires a great deal of forethought and maturity. So I begin to wonder, because I come from a monogamous relationship background, and I understand anything outside of that has more of an affair kind of quality. But in studying and reading about this, it certainly takes an individual who is, like I said, very aware of themselves and able to share their, communicate their desires and their needs to someone else who's capable of listening and hearing that. Because being on the receiving end of something like that can be very difficult for a person who's more geared towards monogamy. As I have read about that, and then I'll share a little bit more. Again, I like to quote my source here. It's Wikipedia, and I've read a few other things, but I'm going to read that and quote that so that if you want to read up on it yourself, you can read exactly what I'm reading and then follow up with more information of your own. So here's a bit of information. The Oneida community in the 1800s in New York, and it was a Christian religious commune, believed strongly in a system of free love known as complex marriage. Now, where any member was free to have sex with another who consented, and possessiveness and exclusive relationships were frowned upon, which is unlike the 20th century social movements such as the sexual revolution, which was in the 60s. Now, the Oneidians did not seek consequence-free sex for pleasure, but they believed that because the natural outcome of intercourse was pregnancy, raising children should be a communal responsibility. Okay, so that sort of answers what I had shared a little bit about the idea about children. But to go on, women over the age of 40 were to act as sexual mentors to adolescent boys, as these relationships had minimal chance of conceiving. Furthermore, these women became religious role models for the young men, and likewise, older men often introduced young women to sex. Noyes often used his own judgment in determining that partnerships that would form, and would often encourage relationships between the non-devout and the devout in the community, and in the hopes that the attitudes and behaviors of the devout would influence the non-devout. So, interesting, in that particular culture, the Oneida community, they encouraged what we would now look upon as polyamorous relationships, because they felt it was a lifestyle that afforded care for the children, and it taught sexuality to people who came up in that experience, young people who were coming up. The older women took care of the younger men, and the older men took care of the younger women. As I say take care of, I mean this respectfully. So it also expanded on the concept of the Christian religion in that open relationship or that relationship situation. Now, modern mainstream Christianity does not accept polyamory, and even though some people do consider themselves Christian and polyamorous. I have a few more words that I'm going to share on polyamorous relationships, and I'll do that right after this break. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And we're back. One of the things that I want to cover now, talking about polyamorous relationships, is, as a practice, separate from polyamory as a philosophical basis for relationships, there are practical ways in which people who live polyamorously arrange their lives and handle certain issues as compared to those of a generally more, I would say, socially acceptable monogamous arrangement. And basically, it's, in practice, the values of fidelity and loyalty. Polyamorous defined fidelity not as a sexual exclusivity, but as a faithfulness to the promises and agreements made about the relationship. So, in other words, a secret relationship violates those accords and would be seen as a breach of fidelity. So it's, monogamous relationships, meaning you have one partner, you have sex only with that partner. And in polyamorous relationships, it's not okay to be sexually involved with somebody that is not known about to the other partners. And then this is not exclusive to just 2 or 3 people. There could be multiple partners, so this can become exponential. And in discussing the difficulties, because I understand that we are having this conversation based on what we recognize, or what I recognize as being a monogamous relationship. And eventually you run into the issue of a breach of trust and a breach of loyalty, and it's how do you handle that? And it could be in a number of things, and not just sex, but it could be that there was a conversation that should have been had with another person and it got skipped, and people feel left out and their feelings are hurt. So how do you deal with that? Well, this kind of relationship forces you to develop very, very, I would say, deep communication skills. When I say deep, I mean intense. You have to be very mindful of things. You have to have a lot of empathy, because if you are the cause of someone's upset, meaning you have failed to communicate something, you have to own up to that responsibility, because it's not a very simple thing. And let me emphasize, everything that I've read about this, and I've read quite a bit, at least since, related to this podcast, it's very complex. There are many layers to it, and the social norms surrounding it. There are lots of laws that support monogamous relationships and the interpretation and the understanding of how that goes. So if you could imagine, when in monogamous relationships, or at least in Western culture, where we understand sexuality between the monogamous couple, infidelity is grounds for divorce. And if something like that were to happen in one of these polyamorous relationships, that is, sex with another person, and then the jealousy that might follow because things just happen to come up. I mean, is there any recourse for something like that other than, being emotionally hurt? I wonder. Doesn't seem to be any, and I've read enough on it to kind of let you know that it's not necessarily something for me. But I wanted to open that up as a conversation piece for people, because if you've never heard of it, it's called Polyamorous Relationships, and it's very detailed. There's certainly not a lot more out there than just Wikipedia, and I've looked at a few references. But it's interesting. It's more than a social experiment. I mean, there are people that practice this in other countries and other cultures. There are even some religions that are okay with it and have created a set of rules around it. And those who might be more familiar with living in a commune style may have more references to it or more access to it, because as a community, there are people that live together and share a lot of chores. It's not exclusive to just commune style living, but it's an interesting experiment. So that's all I have for that on that particular subject. I want to thank you for joining me on the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships podcast. This is episode 38, and I was talking about polyamorous relationships.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.